All right, I'm gonna do like a quick part two, finalize this. Had to take the dog out. Had to go. Had to work on the car. My power steering fluid just literally just fucking like the hose that had it, that had the connector to the power steering under my car. It came undone, and all of the fucking fluid just poured out earlier. It was last night actually. So I've been trying to fuck with it today, trying to fix it, but. If anyone's listening to this that knows anything about cars, you'll probably realize pretty quick that I don't. But yeah, I need to figure that shit out. I'm not really sure. But anyways, so yeah, I think the last thing I was saying was that I had decided to allow myself to look into these deconstruction sources of media, right? I mean, a lot of it was YouTube videos, but there were articles I would read. There was podcasts. There's even a book. I eventually got Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, which obviously if someone's an atheist and you're listening to that, it's like, oh, that's like the number one. It seems like everybody had all these deconstruction. You hear that mentioned a lot, Richard Dawkins, and I mean, for good reason. But I guess for this video, this kind of quick summary, I'm just going to kind of go briefly through the major things that I discovered that made me seriously doubt the veracity, the truth of the Christian faith from the perspective that I was raised in it. And remembering that, like, my perspective was inerrant, biblical, literal. I was a biblicist, right? It was like 100% accurate. Everything, literally every word in the Bible is put there by God. So there's no mistakes. There's certainly no contradictions. There certainly are no purely mythological, non-factual things, right? Anything in the Old Testament that was recorded happened. Elijah flew up on the chariot, fire to heaven, Moses parted the Red Sea. All that stuff is like, I was like, okay, this is true. But then, as I was saying, started to get to a bad place mentally, to just a low point of depression and just wondering why it seemed like God wasn't answering my prayers. And that Rhett and Link podcast was the first thing I saw. The first video I decided to watch, knowing that it was going to challenge my faith, knowing that it was going to be, okay, this video literally says it's a deconstruction. It's going to present things that I'm going to need to probably wrestle with, or I could just keep ignoring them like I had been. But I didn't want to ignore anymore. So that podcast is what got me interested in, and again, I'm not gonna give you all the good scientific data and all of the biblical scholar citations and all that stuff. Like, maybe if I end up doing more videos, like, I think I would like to get into some of that stuff, but I don't want to lose the forest for the trees. This is just kind of like 10,000 feet above, right? I'm just going to give you the kind of talking points of what made me doubt. So the big thing when I finished watching that podcast was evolution. That was like the big thing. And I think a lot of apologists, a lot of Christians, because I remember seeing that stuff when I was a Christian, they would say stuff like, don't go into evolution. Don't look into evolution. That's a stepping stone to the devil, right? Getting a hold on you, that you're going to look at all this science bullshit, right? Evolution, we called it, and that it was going to change your perspective. But it was going to be wrong. It was going to be biased, secular. Secular was like a very bad word for me. If someone was secular, okay, you're apart from. There's no faith. There's no relationship with a higher power. That to me was like, ugh, for the longest time, it was just anything. If it went against the Bible, it had to be false. That was my worldview. So anytime people would talk to me about an earth being 4-something billion years old, evolution, us having a common ancestor with primates, I was like, dude, that's all bullshit, dude. I'm sorry. You want to know why I know it's bullshit? Because the Bible says that God made everybody like that. So I just knew it was fake. I knew it was fake, right? But once I started watching these videos, these YouTube clips, and some of these guys that were talking, some of these scientists, some of these biologists, not English majors like me, people that actually went to school for this shit. I basically, long story short, realized that like evolution, it's called a theory, but to me that's kind of a misleading phrase, kind of a misleading word, because the evolutionary biologist will tell you it's a theory, but we know it's true, right? They will say we have the evidence, we have the proof, we know evolution is kind of the process. And the reason I say it's a theory is because theory means technically that's something that's been proven over and over again or something like that. I don't know. But I realized, okay, these guys, all of these scientists that are not biased, right? They're not Christian, they're not Muslim, they're not Jewish. I mean, some of them are, but I mean, just like the general scientific consensus. I had to, because for the longest time, I had to tell myself, all of these people, they're wrong, right? The vast majority, because even though I believed in creationism, I believed in a young earth, I knew the vast majority of non-Christians didn't. I knew that evolution was by far the most prominent in this old world. Old earth was like the theory that everybody went with outside of us young earthers. And I just had to always think, okay, those guys were deceived. They were deceived by God or by Satan. Maybe not by God, but they were not correct. But then the doubts really started to creep in as I'm seeing all this evidence presented on all these videos I'm watching, right? Talking about how I used to always hear, we don't have any transitionary fossils, right? Like, oh, there's no fossils kind of showing a predecessor primate, maybe related to us in the past, that was the quote-unquote stepping stone, bridging the gap, right, between, modern humans and apes. I've always heard, we don't have any of those. All we have is a bunch of old monkey fossils, right? They're all just a bunch of different apes. But that's just, like, not true. There's so many, there's like hundreds, not hundreds is probably too low, probably thousands of transitionary fossils. You've got Australopithecus, Lucy, you've got all these different ones. And again, I'm not on here, I'm not a scientist. I'm going to fuck all that up if I try to talk about that too much. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I realized that people that were a lot smarter than me, that had gone to school for this shit for years, they seem to have a pretty good handle on it, and a pretty good idea that, no, the Earth is not 6,000 years old, and God didn't. Evolution was the process by which people and all life began, is what I came to. I came to the conclusion that evolution was real. Okay, I was still a Christian at this point. I'm still a Christian. I'm still going through this this is like the beginning of my deconstruction, but I'm still would consider myself a Christian at this point. I still believed, but I then kind of had to start shifting the goalposts a little bit. I had to say, well, all right, can evolution be true and me continue to be a Christian and me believe in God and my faith be okay? And the answer to that was yes. And it wasn't that stressful, honestly. It wasn't that big of a moment for me, because I, of course, knew of other Christians I knew that were old earthers that believed in evolution, called them theistic evolutionists, right? One of my guys I lived with in law school, the chemistry guy, freaking genius. The guy was, he was an old earth creationist or old earth evolutionary guy, but he was a Christian. So I knew that there were people. It wasn't like I had to be a literal 7-day biblicist, like this has to all be exactly correct in order for me to be a Christian. I knew that there were other people out there, but I knew that for the people I knew and my tradition, the people I grew up with, my family, my siblings, my parents, I think it's about 40% of American Christians believe that the biblical flood is real and that Adam and Eve are real people and that the earth was created in 7 days. Basically, 40% of Christians are anti-evolution, are at least at the macro level. They're basically young earth creationists, right? 40-ish%, I think, is the data. I was within that camp. Me and my family we were squarely within that camp. So I'm thinking, okay, well, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to, obviously, it'll be an interesting thing to talk about at dinner time, is what I was kind of thinking, like Thanksgiving. I could say, hey, I'm actually became I no longer think Genesis is literal. Oh, like that'd be like some very interesting conversation. But so I was like, yeah, I can reconcile that. I can reconcile my faith and evolution because just the overwhelming, all the science points to that, right? And I had always been taught that the science didn't point towards evolution. So I was a little bit frustrated, a little bit angry, I think, at maybe like my parents somewhat, and maybe teachers I had in my school systems growing up, my Christian schools, thinking, man, I know you guys probably like you believe what you were teaching, but you didn't maybe. I would have liked to have gotten both sides. I would have liked to have gotten this is the creationist worldview, this is the secular evolutionary best working theory that's not having to do with a God for how we got here and for how life is created. But I never got that. I never got any of that. I was told evolution's fake, it's false, it's all that, all that stuff. So I'm a little bit like, I kind of disappointed in some of the Christians that I used to look up to as a kid and other people I knew. Like, I kind of wish you would give me both sides of the coin because, again, I'm very analytical, very skeptical. There's two sides to every story. So I'm like, I want to know what the other side's saying, right? And that was just off limits for a long time for me in Christianity. I just wouldn't let myself look about what the other side said. But now I did. That first video I watched, it was kind of like the floodgates opened, and I started looking at more stuff. So the first thing was the young earth creationism. That was the first thing to go. And then after that, pretty soon after that, Noah's Ark. That was probably the next one that went. Because I'm thinking, all right, if I can let go of a literal everything in this Bible has to be 100% true, because I'm fairly confident that the Genesis creation story, it's not false per se, but it's an allegory. It's not literal. And I can say that, and I could be a Christian, and I could still be good. So that's just where I'm at the time. So then I think about Noah's Ark, and I think about all the different animals he's got to put in there, and I think, well, I want to say that one probably is also maybe not. I don't know if that happened. So I'm thinking there's probably a localized flood. I'm sure there was a flood. God drowned some of the people. He didn't drown everybody, right? That's kind of where I get to on that. Because I'm a huge history nerd. So the history is kind of the first stuff I went for. So I, after that, stumbled across some guy talking about Exodus, talking about Moses. Oh, it was Derek Lambert, Myth Vision. Great YouTube channel if you're someone who's deconstructing, or just a Christian who's curious about some of these historical figures. You should look into it. Myth Vision. He was another channel that really impacted, I would say, my deconstruction. But he had some videos where he's talking about is the Exodus historical? Is Moses real? Kind of these what seemed like clickbait titles to me. Was Jesus a real person? And I'm like, okay, dude, whatever. But I started watching some of them, and they're not clickbait. That was just how I thought at the time as a Christian. I was like, everybody knows Jesus was real. Like, you could argue whether he was God or not, but everybody knows he was real. But then I just, curiosity, I was like, all right, I've already kind of gone down the evolution path. I allowed myself to look at that data. So let's look at the historical data. Well, I realized pretty quick that there's not a lot of stuff to support Exodus, the biblical Exodus. And when I say that, I mean there is basically zero Egyptian records of a large amount of Jews, which I think it was like 2 million, however many slaves they say in the book. An extremely high population of Jewish slaves in Egypt under Egyptian control that then left mass exodus. There's no evidence for that. There's not a collection of like Jewish, because obviously when they look at the archaeology, they go through the remains from the past, right? They don't see a lot of Jewish and a lot of indicators that the society in ancient Egypt. There's not a lot of indicators that the society in ancient Egypt at that time was Jewish influenced, right? From the archaeology they have. And they also have, the Egyptians kept pretty detailed written records, right? There's not really I shouldn't say there's not really. There is no mention of this mass exodus of all these slaves, let alone the mention of there were 10 plagues that came down where the frogs got in your bed and the locusts, like, I mean, come on, that stuff is not, they didn't talk about that. And so I was like, when I realized that the scholarly, the secular scholarly consensus was that the Exodus didn't happen. That there was not this mass migration of Jewish slaves that escaped Egypt and then went into the Promised Land. It just didn't happen. This one was a lot more unsettling for me than, okay, maybe the creation story wasn't literal. Maybe it was actually evolution. Because it just felt, I don't know, Exodus felt more tangible to me. Maybe even as a kid, the creation story was kind of like, whatever, like maybe that's how it went, maybe that's not. But I definitely believed that, okay, well, Moses got in there and, you know, he got his people out of there and God promised them, if you're faithful to me and follow me, I'm going to lead you to the Promised Land. Like, that all seemed very, like, tangible to me. And all of a sudden it wasn't so tangible anymore because of the lack of record for it. Now, a lot of apologists like to say, what is it? Absence of evidence. Evidence of absence is not evidence. I fucked it up. But basically, just because there's a lack of evidence that there was an Exodus doesn't mean there was not an Exodus. Because this was thousands of years ago, right? They'll say shit like that. They'll say, well, you know, you can't prove that, you know, how many accounts do you have of Alexander the Great back then? Like, how could you prove that he was a real person and all this stuff? And it's like, okay, yeah, you can play that game. But with something as big of a story as Exodus is, and as central as it is to the Christian narrative, to this whole Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant idea, yeah, it was a problem for me. Because of course, this whole time when I'm going through this process of looking into this stuff, I'm still very much like, okay, but God's at the center of this, right? I'm not thinking I'm going through the process of deconstructing my faith. I'm not thinking that at the time. I'm just thinking I was moving the goalposts, right? I was realizing, okay, there are some things I have to reconcile here. To have an intellectually honest basis to believe, right? Because that's obviously important to me. There are some people I believe that can just, and I'm not saying this as an insult, it may sound like an insult. There are people that can just believe shit and just say, fuck it, that's the reality I'm presented, and that's what I'm going to subscribe to, right? I feel like there's seekers, and there's people that just kind of accept what they have. And a lot of people, I think, born in Christianity, born in Islam, born in Judaism, just say, okay, well, this is kind of the framework that I've got. I can see how my parents or so and so, such and so, like they've had a good life, they seem like a good person, and they've gone with this system. So if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me, right? And I was that way for a long time, just because that's, I think, most people, even if you are more of a skeptical, more of a curious person, if you're that deeply indoctrinated like I was, you're gonna leave that stuff till as long as possible. You are not gonna you're not gonna uncover those rocks that are basically, it felt like it was like part of my personality, right? My Christianity. I mean, it was that big, it was that central to my worldview. So I'm getting a little unsettled, right? Because I'm thinking, well, okay, why is there not? There was 2 million Israelites in Egypt, according to the book. Why didn't they have any records of the Israelite slaves and records of Moses? Like, that's a little bit, I don't know. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, if that's one example of a Bible story that is not supported, like, are there others out there? Is there other stuff out there that suggests maybe this isn't true? Because the basis of what I believe, my foundation was the Bible, right? That was my foundation, was God's word. So I knew as long as I had that, as long as I could trust that foundation, then I was going to believe. I was going to keep believing, because that's the basis for which I build my faith, right? Was the word of God. But now I'm not, I'm getting a little bit scared, a little bit like, okay, because I'm like, okay, it seems like Genesis maybe is allegorical, not literal. That seems like it goes against the consensus on that. Okay. And then Exodus, you've got, okay, some issues with that. And of course, I started coming across, as I'm watching these YouTube videos, as you know, the algorithm goes, I'm getting more recommendations. So all of a sudden I'm getting, top 50 contradictions in the New Testament. Or, did you know that the four Gospels were anonymous? Which is true. They're not, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This blew my mind as a Christian. I should have known this, but I didn't. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, are not they are not attributed to those four authors in the books. Meaning, those four books, those four Gospels, they're anonymous. They were named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because that was like a common practice back then. That's what they would do. They would name them. And of course, I'm not suggesting that the church doesn't teach that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors of those four books, because the church does teach that. And that's what I believed growing up, that Luke was the physician. Luke was the foot doctor, right? And he was the one who wrote about the history. And then, Mark was the one who wrote first. And then John was kind of like the beloved, right? I think he was the favorite. I don't know. I've had a couple PBRs tonight, but John kind of having this different kind of tone to his gospel, right? I was always believing that, okay, those are the four guys, but that's actually not the case. We don't know who wrote them, is what I would say. We don't know. And any Christian scholar who's being honest with you will tell you that they are anonymous and that we don't know. Because to me, it was like, well, damn, 4 eyewitness accounts. That's what I would always hear, like, as a kid. And I use that as, like, some of my arguments, because I would argue against atheists, over the years, online or whatever, in person, because I love to argue with people. I really do. And I would say, you got 4 eyewitness accounts that Jesus went and died. And he not only died, he lived this full life. And you've got 4 different people who verify that. 4 different people who followed him. And their accounts line up, right? In perfect synchrony. There's no errors. There's no contradictions between these 4. That's what I believed, because I was a biblicist. But as I'm getting these YouTube videos popping up about all these contradictions and shit, I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting, and again, this is not the video of me going through the specifics on these. I might do that later if I end up sticking with this channel, but I'll just throw some examples out there. Anyone watching this, please do not just hear what I say and just believe it. Of course, I would hope that you would do your homework. The phrase "do your own research" I think has been kind of hijacked these days, but you should do your research. You shouldn't just take what I have to say for it. You shouldn't take what your pastor has to say for it. You should read the text. The Bible is supposed to be the Word of God. It's the most important thing, right, as a Christian. So you should do your own research into this stuff. So fact check what I'm saying. But Luke gets a lot of stuff wrong, like historical stuff. So Luke talks about a census at the beginning of his gospel. He talks about how the reason that Mary and Joseph were going down to Jerusalem was because there was this census ordered by Caesar, right? That everybody had to go back to their hometown. They had to go back to where they're from. And I might get some of the towns and shit wrong on this. Again, I'm not a historian, so that's what I'm saying. Fact check me. But I know what I'm saying right now. The gist of it is true. Some of the names might be wrong, but so Luke's gospel, they're supposed to go back for the census, right? Luke names, I think, the governor of the region, I'm going to butcher the name, Quinarius or something like that. Basically, the guy that Luke named as the ruling governor during the time of the census when Jesus was a little baby, that guy was not in charge yet. It was the wrong guy. And if you look into it, it's pretty ironclad. It's pretty like, oh, this was like an error, because the guy that Luke mentioned was a ruler like 6 or 10 years ahead of that time, meaning that Jesus, based upon the dates of Jesus being born, they were able to verify that guy was not in charge at that time, right? So I saw that and I was like, okay. And then you have stuff with, like, for instance, Judas. This is again out of the Gospels, but I don't know what book of what gospel it is that says that how Judas died, but obviously you have Acts saying that he fell and like busted his rib open. Basically, he fell headlong, I think is the phrase they use, fell headlong in that field that he got for the 30 pieces of silver, busted open his stomach and died. The gospel says he hung himself, right? So it's like, again, these are two different ways of dying. He either hung himself or he fell headlong and busted his guts open, but he didn't do both, right? And you may be thinking, if you're not from the kind of if you're from a less strict tradition, you're like, what's the big deal, dude? Like, okay, there was a slight different, there were two versions of the same story, but we know Judas was bad. We know he betrayed Jesus. That's what really matters, right? But you got to understand, from my upbringing, from my perspective, there were zero errors. The Bible is perfect. The Bible is literally a perfect book, right? That's what I was taught. That's what I believed. So it's a big problem when I see stuff. I start to see these things where I'm like, oh, these are two different events, two different narrations of the same event. I don't know about this. There's another example. Old Testament. Everybody thinks David killed Goliath. But in 2 Samuel, there's some other dude that does it. His name is like Enalaha or some crap. I don't know his name, but there was a second guy that is the one that actually did it in 2 Samuel. So it's like, there's a lot of stuff like that I found. And again, I'm still a Christian at this point. So I don't want anyone to watching this thinking like, well, dude, you found out that Judas, there's two different ways of Judas's death, and that's what made you leave the faith. Like, you were never saved. Like, I don't want to. No, I was still. That wasn't enough to make me leave. It wasn't enough to make me jump off the boat. But it was troubling to say the least. As I keep, it was like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like, a lot of people I see ask when people have deconstructed, what was it? That's the big question. Like, what was the one thing that happened to you? The one thing that you saw or discovered that made you realize, I can't believe this anymore. But it wasn't like that for me. There's not one thing that I could say is what led me to cross the line from belief into disbelief. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. I began to lose confidence that the Bible was true. Over the course of several months, as I'm looking into this stuff, right? And one of my best friends, the guy at law school who really helped strengthen my faith, he was in seminary. He's still in seminary right now. And I would text him and call him. Because we talk a lot anyways. We just talk, catch up. But he was my accountability partner on a lot of things. So me and him are very close spiritually, like not just as friends, right? And I started to let him in on some of the stuff I was thinking, some of the stuff I started to feel, the doubts I'd had. And to my relief, he was like, dude, I had the same doubts. I've had some of the same questions. And that was super comforting to me, because this guy, I viewed him as this guy's so much better than me in terms of his spiritual walk. Like, this guy walks the walk because he's in seminary to be a pastor. He controls himself. The guy doesn't drink too much. He's just a good dude. He's a great dude. He's one of the best guys to this day. Love the guy. So I was like, okay, if my buddy, who is such a strong Christian, can tell me with confidence that he has had doubts as well, that he has had he has wrestled with those same questions, that made me feel a lot better all of a sudden, right? I'm thinking, well, you know what? I'm going to get through this. I'm going to talk to him, and I'm going to keep doing research. So, because he came from a different background than me. His background was not 100% biblicist. Everything in here is 100% literal truth. He kind of introduced me to, well, you don't have to think of everything as literal, and that it all has to just be exactly how it was written. Can't you leave some room for, there's stories, there's allegories, there's poetry in the Bible. There's all different forms of prose, and that's true. And that gave me comfort. It did. But the system in which I was raised, this extremely, for lack of a better word, legalistic system of every word in here is not just God inspired, but it's God speaking to you. That can, and to this day, that's not left me. That ingrained belief of everything in here is supposed to have been from God. Now, I don't believe it's from God anymore, but I still believe that if you're going to follow the evangelical doctrine, you're supposed to believe that this stuff is all useful, right? Because the Bible says that every scripture is useful for teaching and instruction. But I started to think maybe not all of it is useful. If some of it is contradictory, some of it I think is historically didn't maybe happen. And then I started to get into another territory in the Old Testament. I had always heard, when I would give a cursory glance to like an atheist arguments where I'd watch, like YouTube videos of like Christian apologist destroys stupid atheists. Like I used to live for that stuff, man. I would watch all that stuff, like John Lennox, William Lane Craig, all those guys just poning the atheist noobs, right? Owning the libs, so to speak. So I live for that stuff. But I started to realize as I was going through getting some of these recommendations that there was a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that I had either forgot about or was never taught when I was a kid. There are some, and it's funny, Christians will call them problematic passages. That's what they call them, usually problematic or troubling. I think that's an understatement for some of these passages in the Old Testament. But we can go with problematic if that's the word, the semantic to use. But yeah, I discovered, like, dude, there is some fucked up shit that goes on in the Old Testament. And again, I'm coming from this, trying to reconcile this literal, everything in this Bible is true worldview with kind of this new infusion I've got from my friend and from necessity, basically, of me starting to work out, okay, this can't all be literal. It cannot all be literal because that is a literal false statement that Luke said there. That is a contradiction that Luke has with the author of Acts. They cannot both be true. One of them is wrong. Therefore, the Bible's not 100% accurate, right? So I'm wrestling with that. And then I see these passages in the Old Testament. And again, I might get some of the names wrong. I might get some of the dates wrong. I encourage you to look this up, but I'm confident in what I'm speaking to you right now. The Bible has got, I would always hear, the Bible promotes genocide. The Bible promotes slavery. The Bible promotes rape, sexual slavery. No women's rights, anti-homosexuality, which I knew about the women's rights and the homosexuality. Of course, I was all on board with that. Sorry, if you're gay, you're not going to heaven. I mean, that's how it was, right? If you read the New Testament, especially, it's pretty clear. Paul makes it pretty clear that if you're engaging in homosexual behavior, if you're engaging in heterosexual behavior where you're not married yet, it's the same punishment. You're in trouble. So I had no problem with any of that. I was homophobic and I was sexist. Like I'll say that pretty openly. I used to be that way because that's what the Bible taught. And I'm sure people are going to be offended at that if anybody hears this. But if you look at what Paul says, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it is what it is. But so yeah, I knew there was passages in the Old Testament about stoning gay people and about women, people having multiple wives, and that it was just, I was always heard that it was different. My dad would say it was different back then. So in the Old Testament, it was a different time, and God used different ways to rule his people, and it wasn't the same as it is now. So I actually didn't really, which is as horrible as this sounds, the idea of, okay, they're stoning people for sexual crimes, or women are, a crime against a man's wife is more of a property crime, the way they describe it. It's not really a personal crime, because women were viewed as property back then. As sad as it is, I was like, I understood that. I accepted that. I accepted that as, okay, well, these people are just, that's part of their time. And of course, we don't stone gay people today, but I would have still told you that that person's going to hell, and then that person's living a wrong and incorrect lifestyle that's going to be punished in the afterlife. And I may have gone so far, a lot of Christians, not a lot, I shouldn't say that. Christians I know, Christians in my family would tell you that certain sexually transmitted diseases, were punishments from God that maybe the gay community suffered from, that it was God punishing people for being so sexually immoral, kind of like a Sodom and Gomorrah 2.0 type thing, I guess. But so the gay stuff and the women stuff, it was like, okay, whatever. But I shouldn't say whatever. I mean, it was horrible. It still is horrible. But I just didn't recognize it at the time. I really didn't recognize it. I had the blinders on. Then I start seeing, okay, here's a verse. I think it's the Canaanites. I don't know what book it's in, but it's in the Old Testament. God commands, go in there and wipe out everybody. Don't leave a single person left, right? And Saul, he was commanding this to Saul, right? So Saul does that. He kills everybody, but I think he saves some of the animals. Maybe he saves some of the women, right? And God is really pissed at him for this, that he left people alive, right? Because he went against his will. And he hardened Saul's heart because of this. He literally, at my interpretation as a Christian, was he made it to where Saul used to be. This gets into losing your salvation. I'm not getting into that right now, but Saul went from someone who was of God, that was one of God's people, to not being of God, because God hardened his heart, right? Because he disobeyed him. And I was always taught kind of this divine command theory morality, kind of this like, well, if God said it, then that's the law, man. It is what it is. Like, you can't really, it's like sucks to suck, basically. You can't disobey it. His ways are higher than ours. We don't understand all that stuff. So his commands are his commands, and it's moral. That's what morality is, right? Whatever God says. I started to have a hard time accepting that when I'm seeing, well, dang, God ordered this whole population group, this whole culture. He ordered them to be exterminated because they were against his people, right? And there's other examples where another group, Moses says, and this is not God saying. This is not God saying this in this example. This is Moses saying this. So Christians will say, "Well, Moses, not God." Okay, I'll grant you that. But still, Moses telling his men, kill everyone except the virgin girls, except the young girls, and basically the ones that you like, those can become your wives. So we're looking at some form of sexual slavery. And again, Christians will say it was a different time, and those people would have had a way worse quality of life or whatever. So that was the best thing for them. Again, I don't think it's a good look to be in the place of having to justify owning another person, whether it's owning a woman, owning a male slave. Christians will get into, the Bible has it was really more like indentured servitude. Again, it's talking about owning another human being. It's pretty straightforward. I think a lot of Christians have to try to make the text say something it doesn't say, and that is one of my biggest frustrations, I think, now as someone who's deconstructed. But seeing these quote-unquote problematic passages where it's like, damn, God is unleashing just fury on people. And it was women, children, it was people that I was like, okay, are all these people deserving of this? Because, of course, I knew about the flood. When I believed the flood was a literal world flood, I was like, well, God already did kill everybody, basically everybody. And I was okay with that. Because I thought, the world was so sinful, they were so evil, it's what they deserved. Because as a Calvinist, I viewed it as like anybody who is saved, anybody who gets to go to heaven, because it's a gift. You're not born entitled to heaven. Certainly, you're born entitled to hell and judgment. Anybody that escapes that judgment, it's a bonus, right? That's literally how I viewed it, was that if you don't go to hell, then that's awesome. But we all deserve it. I thought I deserved it, definitely. I thought we're all fallen, we're all evil, deplorable, sinful creatures. So hell is our just desserts. But God is so merciful that he'll let some people not go to hell. Then I started thinking, okay, so are these little bitty babies that would have drowned in this flood, these toddlers, even, I don't know, say 7 or 8 year old kid, those kids, I guess God, I'm trying to rationalize it in my brain. I'm thinking, well, God knew that they would have grown up to be sinful, that they would have grown up to do that. And it started to become, I had to start doing more and more mental gymnastics to say, this is still a good God, right? Because at the end of the day, you got to believe that your God is good, that you're worshiping, right? If you lose that, then you kind of lose the plot. because we would always say, what is it that you say in church? And in general, God is good all the time, and God is good. So of course, it's a foundational kind of tenet of the faith is that you're worshiping God who's worthy of worship, that he's a moral, just God, right? I always talk about objective morality and that God is the source of our morality. I believe that, right? I believed that the only reason that I'm not out killing people and murdering people and doing all kinds of horrible shit is because of God, the Holy Spirit, is because that God has put this moral compass in me, right? But then I'm looking at the Old Testament and I'm going, well, let's say God's not God for a second. Let's say he's just a person. Let's say he's a king or a ruler. And he does the exact same things that God does. He orders the slaughter of entire people groups that he is against, right? He orders that he prescribes rules on how to best treat your slaves, on which slaves you can beat, and how to, if your slave has a kid, what the process is that your kid or the slave's kid? I mean, there's all there's all kinds of rules about slavery in the Old Testament, all kinds of rules. And some of them are man-made, some of them are according to the text given from God. So I'm just thinking, if this was a human being that did this, that gave us rules about how to best own other humans, how to kill other humans, and what's shellfish to eat, I'm just thinking, we would not think this is a good guy. We would not like this guy if this was a person. So then you hear atheists and agnostics, people will say, being a Christian requires a great amount of special pleading. And I didn't believe that when I was a Christian. I thought, that's just something they say. It's not true. I don't have to special plead anything. God, I have a justification for everything I believe. 1 Peter, I think it's 3:15 says, be prepared to have an answer for the hope that you have. And I always thought I had a good answer. I always thought, well, I may not understand everything in the Bible. I may not understand God's timing, God's reasoning, but it's God. So it's good. But it just started, the puzzle just started to slowly come apart for me. And a lot of it had to do with these Old Testament passages of just brutal murders and sacrifices. I mean, even stories that I had been pretty comfortable with, like the story of Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we heard that story when I was a kid in Bible study, but I don't remember them drilling down on Lot offering his 2 virgin daughters for the men outside to have sex with, to placate them. I don't remember that. And God says that Lot was a good man, right? He was the only good man in that whole city. And he's offering his daughters for sex with strangers so that way he can protect his house guests. I guess that's good etiquette. I don't know. But stuff like that. I started to question it. Okay, that same story, Lot's wife, what happens to her? They're leaving the city. She turns around to just get one last look to see, okay, that's my home. That's where I grew up. That's where I would have had my first friendships, my first kiss, all of those things, right? Because these are people too. These are people back then. These are not just characters. According to my worldview, right at the time, these are real people that lived. And God said, you turned around, you disobeyed me. I'm going to turn you into salt. That's tough, right? That she got turned into salt for turning around. And I don't know if that was like she got turned into like a salt shaker. I don't know if she became like a giant Epsom sea salt bottle or if she became just a big ass pile of salt. I don't know. I'd be interested to see what that looked like. Of course, I don't think it happened now. But of course, if you're an evangelical, you think that literally happened. But I thought, so Lot basically gets off scot-free by, for offering his daughters for sex and for basically just being like a shitty dude. But his wife meets that fate. And then of course you have a lot of incest. You have Noah sleeping with his daughters. They get him drunk and he sleeps with them and he curses them. I mean, there's just a lot of shit like that in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially. You have an example of David. Like he was like such a big, almost like a hero to me, right? Like David was the guy. David was, in a lot of ways, you've got Adam, you've got Abraham, you've got Moses, and then you kind of have David, and then you have Jesus. I mean, that's kind of how I viewed it. And that's how a lot of Christians view it too, I think, is like there are these huge, kind of like rock stars of Christianity that we can see through time, right? And there's really not that many of a bigger rock star than David. You know, David was a man after God's own heart. That's what we hear. But then you've got David when he sent his general away to get him killed so he could bang his wife Bathsheba. God's not pleased with this, right? Which, okay, I'm like, okay, that's good, because David had a guy killed so he could bang his wife. Like, that's not good. And I'm glad that God's not pleased with that. But what's the punishment for that? If you go back and read it, and some people might think I'm making this up, but I'm not. God ordered David's, I think the translation says concubines. You could argue if that's wives or prostitutes. Either way, David had a lot of women that he slept with. God ordered one of David's best friends. He said, what's going to happen now is you're cursed, basically, and one of your good friends is going to sleep with all of your concubines in public. Everyone's going to know about it. It's going to be a great shame to you. Let's not think about the fact that these women had zero say in this matter, right? It was just, it was part of the punishment for David. There was no consideration given to what these women were thinking about. Well, I guess I'm part of this now. I got to go have sex with this guy. There's no yes or no to it. The same punishment, God also has his firstborn. I think it's his firstborn. It's one of his kids. One of his kids dies because of this. And this is from God. And I'd always believed and been taught that God is not the author of evil, right? That God kind of has two wills. God has a permissive will where he allows things to happen because we live in a fallen world, but that's not him orchestrating them. He's got a permissive will, and then he also has an orchestrative will, or a prescriptive will, where he does order things to happen, where he does affect the outcomes of things, where, for example, he prescribed Jesus to come down. He prescribed Judas to betray Jesus, right? Because that had to happen in order for the story to be fulfilled. But he allows things like natural disasters. He allows things like kids getting cancer and dying. He allows things like people I know, like my old man, my dad, who's like the strongest Christian I know. And this is, I may do a video on this, the problem of evil and the problem of sickness. My dad is pretty sick. The past couple of years, he's got Parkinson's, and it's a quick decline, and it sucks. But I would have thought, and I used to think, well, that's just God's allowing that to happen. Of course, God's not causing that to happen, because my dad is like one of the strongest Christians I know, and he would never punish my dad. And we weren't taught that. We weren't taught that God punishes that way. But you have to accept, if you're a Calvinist and you believe in the sovereignty of God, you have to accept that God is definitely allowing my dad to, slowly lose the ability to walk and to start to have early forms of dementia. And again, this is not a pity party, and this is not, if people hear this and they think this is just a guy who's angry at God and he's lashing out. You can think that, that's fine. I mean, there's a lot of factors that led to where I'm at right now. That was certainly one of them. And again, I might talk more about that later, but yeah. So just kind of started to think, man, there are a lot of excuses I'm having to make for this God, right? Once I allowed myself to say, well, let's examine this. Let's be critical of this scholarship. Let's be critical of this text. I started to think, man, there are some problems in here for me personally. Because if I don't think it's a good God, if I don't think that this is a God that truly is all loving, then what am I doing here? Am I wasting my life? Am I wrong? And that's what I started to think is am I wrong? And I had never thought that before. Through all my doubt, even when I would question whether I was saved or not, I never thought I could be wrong about this. I always knew that Christianity was true. I just worried maybe I was not one of his chosen, right? But the thoughts began to come in of, I'm not sure if this shit is even real. I'm not sure if this is true. The longer I looked at it, the more I came to believe and become convinced that this is a man-made book. This is a man-made religion. These are things that were created by people a long time ago that were doing the best they could at the time, that were trying to make sense of it all, man. Because God knows we don't have all the answers right now. They sure as hell didn't have them back then, 2,000 years ago. And I can only imagine how fucking terrifying it would be to be somebody who's just walking around 2,000 years ago. Okay, I'm alive now, and what the hell is going on? I've got to go find food. I've got to go find shelter. I've got a group of people across the river who are trying to kill me, and they believe. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. So I don't have anger for that. Like, I don't blame. I think all humans, it's human nature to have an innate desire to ask why and to know why. And there's just certain things that we're never going to know. And that used to really bother me. As a Christian, I would think, man, when I get up to heaven, the first thing I'm going to ask God is, why'd you do this? And what is this? And why is this like that? Not in like an accusatory way, but like in a, like, I'm happy to know the answers way. I was always, even when I was a creationist, I was like, man, the 98% of DNA with chimpanzees, scientists saying that's our closest living relative. Like, I want to ask God, man, were you kind of trying to play a trick on us? Because damn, it sure did make it seem like evolution made a lot of sense, man. You know, you look at one of those chimps, and you look at us, and you're like, man, there's a lot of similarities there. And I was like, it was like a happy curiosity of like, I can't wait to find those answers. But then as I got more and more, I should say less and less secure in my confidence in the truth of the Bible, I started to think, you know, maybe this is just stuff that nobody's ever going to know. These guys didn't know it back then, and they were doing the best they could with what they had. And maybe that's why, I don't know if there probably are apologists. There's probably videos that will say, these are all these scientific claims the Bible proves, and this shows the Bible's accurate. I haven't seen a lot of that in the Bible. You know, I know the Bible pretty well. I don't see a lot of things, because I've looked. I wish that there was something I could point to and go, man, that's something that had to have been divinely inspired. That's something that they wrote that 2,000 years ago, and there's no way that they could have known that. But the Bible doesn't have stuff like that, man. The Bible doesn't seem to be aware of modern science and of modern genetics and even stuff as simple as like washing your hands. I mean, it's not in there. And of course, we don't expect the Bible to just be a all-encompassing book, right? I mean, I'm not trying to put that expectation on it, but you would think if this is written, you would think if this is written by the most powerful being on the planet of all time, that there would maybe be some more stuff in there that kind of lines up. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, but I slowly came to a position of, okay, I think the Old Testament, I'm going to have to let that go. At this point, I'm still a believer, but I'm thinking, I don't think that the Old Testament is just too problematic. There's just too much stuff in there that I think is either historical stuff that's not true, which gives me pause, or it's it's stuff about God's character that is not good. Like, that is not something that I would consider moral. And where did I get my morality from? I thought at the time I got it from God. So I'm thinking, this is God going against what I was told that. This is God going against the traits that I was told that God had, right? I was told that God was all loving, that he was patient, that he was kind. Of course, I was told that God was a jealous God and that he was a just God and that he had wrath, you know, and God's righteous wrath. And I was okay with that. But I became less okay with it when I started to think, well, this historical stuff doesn't seem to line up. And this other stuff just kind of starts to seem like this might just be a group of this tribe, right? This ancient tribe of this culture of people who were kind of getting shit on a bunch. Let's be honest. Like, the Jews were kind of like the unlucky, you know, especially if you believe the Exodus narrative, they were captive by the Egyptians. They were held captive by the Babylonians, which that we actually know is historical. They were kind of the unlucky losers throughout the early antiquities in the Middle East. They were getting their shit pushed on a bunch. So it started to kind of seem like some kind of almost like fan fiction where these guys are writing about wiping out all their enemies, wiping out the Philistines, wiping out the Canaanites, wiping out the Amalekites. But again, when I went to go see the evidence for that, to see, okay, well, if the Jews killed an entire, they killed all the Canaanites, right, except the women or whatever, there's got to be something, probably some evidence of that. Maybe there's, I don't know what it would look like, but there's not. There's not a source of evidence for any of that stuff. So that's when I became someone who I would say a very progressive form of Christianity is what I came into. I became someone who would have said, I'm a theistic evolutionist. God created the world, but he used evolution to do it. And the Old Testament there are some historical things in there. There's a lot of ahistorical stuff that is, you could categorize as fantasy, you could categorize as mythology based upon, when you look at other cultures at that time and the kind of stuff they were writing, it shares a lot in common. But I became someone who said, you know what, I'm going to focus on Jesus, because Jesus is my guy, right? I mean, he's the dude. I prayed. It wasn't usually dear God. It was usually dear Jesus. Jesus was like, all right, I've got Jesus. I don't really need anything else. He's the way, the truth, and the life, right? He's my number one. He's my best friend. He's someone I've talked to like on a daily basis, like my whole life. So I know I've got Jesus still. So I started to kind of just think, you know what? I might just be a Christian who reads the Gospels and maybe doesn't get too much into the Old Testament. But I ran into some problems with this over time. I really did, because it felt like, okay, if I'm going to try to just say that the Old Testament is all bullshit, basically, I realized you kind of need the Old Testament for the whole system to kind of work. Because if you don't have the Old Testament, then you have questions about original sin and Adam and Eve. You have questions about the genealogies and about why was this sacrifice needed in the first place of Jesus coming down. So it got pretty messy pretty quick. Because as I'm going through kind of my this research, I'm thinking, all right, well, let me look at Neanderthals, right? I was always curious about that. And I got to take a piss, so I think I'm going to pause this, and I'll come back to it. Neanderthals, right? Okay.